Hello. Today we are reading from Everything's an Argument with Readings, 4th edition, by Andrea A. Lunsford, John J. Ruszkiewicz, and Keith Walters. Chapter 5, Thinking Rhetorically. When the 30-second spot first aired in late March 2004, many viewers reacted with disbelief. What the guy with the mustache? And a sexy underwear model? It couldn't be, could it? But it was. Counterculture, folk legend, pop icon, and 1997 Kennedy Center honoree Bob Dylan crooning "Lovesick" in a TV ad for Victoria's Secret, a purveyor of sexy women's underclothes. Dylan, who had never before pitched a product other than his own recordings, now looked like a cross between Snidely Whiplash and Salvador Dali, as he traded glances with a winged vixen in high heels. The bard who'd penned "The Times They Are a-Changin' and Blowin' in the Wind" had sold his birthright. Disillusioned critics charged for, yikes, a bra and blue panties. Media critic Seth Stevenson, writing in Slate, devoted a full column to analyzing the pitch, trying first to figure out why an artist of Dylan's stature would do a commercial. Money? Whimsy? Exposure? But then he turns to a question just as intriguing, especially if, thinking rhetorically, one is curious about how ads work their persuasive magic. Why would a brand that's about sexiness, youth, and glamour want any connection at all with a decrepit 60-something folk singer? The answer, my friend, is totally unclear. Even if Victoria's Secret hopes to bring in more boomer women, do those women want their underwear to exude the spirit and essence of Bob Dylan? Or conversely, is Bob Dylan the sort of man they're hoping to attract? Even if you're of the belief that men frequently shop at VS for their ladies, I still don't see the appeal of this ad. I, for instance, am a man, and I can assure you that Bob Dylan is not what I'm looking for in a woman's undergarment. And if I found him there, man, would that be disturbing. Victoria's Secret wouldn't return my calls, but media reports say the idea of putting Dylan's face in the ad — they'd been using his song "Lovesick" in ads for the past year or so — came straight from corporate chief Les Wexner. To the company's surprise, Dylan accepted their offer. It's at this point that someone at Victoria's Secret should have stopped the madness. Just because you can hire Bob Dylan as the figurehead for your lingerie line doesn't mean you should. Perhaps no one was willing to say no to the big boss, or perhaps they fully expected Dylan to say no. Joke's on them. Seth Stevenson, tangled up in boobs. To pose the sort of questions Stevenson asks here is to perform, on a small scale, what's called a rhetorical analysis, a close reading of a text to find how and whether it works to persuade. In just these few paragraphs from a longer piece, Stevenson considers some of the basic strategies of argument explored in this book's preceding chapters. He first identifies the ethos of the company making the appeal: sexiness, youth, glamour, and finds it hard to reconcile with the ethos of the celebrity in the ad: decrepit, 60-something. He considers the emotional pull the TV commercial might have, maybe enticing dirty old men to buy expensive underwear for their ladies, but then rejects the logic of that approach. Even men who shop for underwear at Victoria's Secret certainly don't want to think about Bob Dylan when they do. Then Stevenson takes a step beyond the ad itself to consider the rhetorical world in which it might have been created, one in which it would seem so cool to have a superstar spokesperson like Bob Dylan that you don't think about the messages you might be sending. Stevenson's conclusion? Joke's on them. Whenever you encounter a similarly puzzling, troubling, or even successful appeal, try subjecting it to a rhetorical analysis of your own, asking yourself what strategies the piece employs to move your heart, win your trust, and change your mind, and why it does or doesn't do so. Here's how. Composing a rhetorical analysis. Arguments have many strategies, but exactly how does a Bose ad make you want to buy new speakers, or an op-ed piece in the Washington Post suddenly change your thinking about school vouchers? A rhetorical analysis might help you understand. You perform a rhetorical analysis by analyzing how well the components of an argument work together to persuade or move an audience. You can study arguments of any kind, advertisements, as we've seen, or editorials, political cartoons, perhaps even movies or photographs. If everything really is an argument, then just about any communication can be opened up rhetorically. Because arguments have many aspects, you may need to focus a rhetorical analysis on elements that stand out or make the piece intriguing or problematic. You could begin by exploring issues such as the following. What is the purpose of this argument? What does it hope to achieve? Who is the audience for this argument? What appeals or techniques does the argument use? Emotional, logical, ethical? Who is making the argument? What ethos does it create? And what values does it assume? How does it try to make the writer or creator seem trustworthy? What authorities does the argument rely on or appeal to? What facts are used in the argument? What logic? What evidence? How is the evidence arranged and presented? What claims are advanced in the argument? What issues are raised and which ones are ignored or perhaps evaded? What are the contexts, social, political, historical, cultural, for this argument? Whose interests does it serve? Who gains or loses by it? What shape does the argument take? How is the argument presented or arranged? What media do the argument use? How does the language or style of the argument work to persuade an audience? Questions like these should get you thinking, but don't just describe techniques and strategies in a rhetorical analysis. Instead, show how the key devices in an argument actually make it succeed or fail. Quote language freely from a written piece, or describe the elements in a visual argument. Annotating a visual text is one option. Show readers where and why an argument makes sense and where it seems to fall apart, just as Stevenson does in the Victoria's Secret ad. If you believe that an argument startles audiences or challenges them, insults them, or lulls them into complacency, explain precisely why that's so and provide evidence. Don't be surprised when your rhetorical analysis itself becomes an argument. That's what it should be. Understanding the purpose of an argument. To understand how well any argument works, ask what its purpose might be. To sell shoes, to advocate social security reform, to push a political agenda. In many cases, that purpose may be obvious, or at least seem so. A conservative newspaper will likely advance a right-wing agenda on its editorial page. Ads from a baby food company will show happy infants delighted with stewed prunes and squash, but some projects may be coy about their persuasive intentions or blur the lines between types of argument. Perhaps you've responded to a mail survey or telephone poll only to discover that the questions are leading you to switch your cell phone service. Does such a stealthy argument succeed? That may depend on whether you're more intrigued by the promise of cheaper phone rates than offended by the bait and switch. The deception could provide material for a thoughtful rhetorical analysis in which you measure the strengths, risks, and ethics of such strategies. Genre can be important in determining how to assess an argument. You probably know the difference between different types or genres of arguments. Say between an op-ed column and a bumper sticker. You'd have every right to challenge an argument in an editorial if it lacks sufficient evidence. You'd look foolish making the same complaint about a bumper sticker, but you could still expect that a bumper sticker meet the expectations of its genre. Compressed, attention-getting, sometimes clever or sarcastic argument. Understanding who makes an argument. Knowing who is claiming what is key to any analysis. That's why you'll usually find the name of a person or an institution attached to an argument or persuasive appeal. Remember the statements included in TV ads during the last federal election campaign? Hello, I'm Jane Doe, and I approve this ad. Federal law requires such statements so that viewers can tell the difference between ads actually endorsed by candidates and those sponsored by special interest groups not always affiliated with the campaigns. Their interests and motives might be very different. Of course, knowing an author's name is just a starting place for a serious analysis. You need to dig deeper whenever you don't recognize the author of an argument or the institution sponsoring it, and sometimes even when you do. You could do worse than to Google the internet to discover more about such people or groups. What else have they produced? By whom have they been published? The Wall Street Journal? The blog Daily KOs? Or perhaps Spin? Big difference. If a group has a website, what can you learn about its goals, policies, contributors, and very important, funding? These days, you can't afford to be naive about who's asking for your ear, nor do you have an excuse for ignoring the biases, special interests, and conflicts of interest in people competing for your attention. The information is out there for you to find. Identifying and appealing to audiences. Audience is the third person of the rhetorical trinity, after author and purpose. Most arguments are composed with specific audiences in mind, and their success depends in part on how well their strategies, content, tone, and language meet the expectations of readers or viewers in analyzing an argument. You must first identify its target audiences, remembering how complex that notion can be. See audiences for arguments on pages 32 to 37, but you can usually make an educated judgment because most arguments have contexts that one way or another describe whom they intend to reach and in what ways. Both a photocopied sheet stapled to a bulletin board in a college dorm, Why You Should Be a Socialist, and a 40-foot billboard for Bud Light might be aimed at the same general population, college students, but each will adjust its appeals for the different moods of that group in different moments. The political screed will likely be deliberately simple in layout and full of earnest language. We live in a world of obscene inequality, to appeal to students in a serious vein, while the liquor ad will be visually stunning and virtually text-free to connect with students when they aren't quite so worried about uniting the workers of the world. Your rhetorical analysis might make a case for the success or failure of such audience-based strategies. You might also examine how a writer or an argument establishes credibility with an audience. One very effective means of building credibility, you will discover, comes through a 7-letter word made famous by Aretha Franklin: respect. Respect is crucial in arguments that invoke audiences who don't agree on critical issues or who may not have thought carefully about the issues presented. In introducing an article on problems facing African American women in the workplace, editor-in-chief of Essence, Diane Weathers, considers the problems she faced with respecting all her potential readers. We spent more than a minute agonizing over the provocative cover line for our feature, White Women at Work. The countless stories we had heard from women across the country told us that this was a workplace issue we had to address. From my own experience at several major magazines, it was painfully obvious to me that black and white women are not on the same track. Sure, we might all start out in the same place, but early in the game, most sisters I know become stuck, and the reasons have little to do with intelligence or drive. At some point, we bump our heads against that ceiling, and while white women may complain of a glass ceiling, for us, the ceiling is concrete. So how do we tell this story without sounding whiny and paranoid, or turning off our white female readers, staff members, advertisers, and girlfriends? Our solution? Bring together real women, several of them highly successful senior corporate executives, put them in a room, promise them anonymity, and let them speak their truth. Diane Weathers, speaking our truth. Both paragraphs affirm Weathers' determination to treat audiences fairly and to deal honestly with a difficult subject. The strategy would merit attention in any rhetorical analysis. Look too for signals that writers share values with readers or at least understand an audience. In the following passage, writer Jack Solomon is very clear about one value he hopes readers have in common: a preference for straight talk. There are some signs in the advertising world that Americans are getting fed up with fantasy advertisements and want to hear some straight talk. Weary of extravagant product claims and irrelevant associations, consumers trained by years of advertising to distrust what they hear seem to be developing an immunity to commercials. Jack Solomon, Masters of Desire, The Culture of American Advertising. It's a pretty safe assumption, isn't it? Who favors double talk or duplicity? But writers or advertisers can manage even more complex appeals to values. Talking the talk to target specific groups and their experiences, values, and perceptions. Here's media critic Seth Stevenson again, first summarizing ads in a new anti-smoking campaign directed specifically at teens. The spots, they appear to be episodes of a sitcom called Fair Enough. In this series of 30-second segments, a team of tobacco executives brainstorms new ways to market to teens. Among their ideas, fruit-flavored chewing tobacco, tobacco in the form of a gumball, and an effort to win influence with the hipster crowd by giving them free packs of smokes. Seth Stevenson, How to Get Teens Not to Smoke. Then he does a rhetorical analysis, explaining why the particular TV spot will resonate with its target audience. The creators of the ad clearly knew what might motivate teens to give up cigarettes: insecurity. In fact, the ultimate adolescent nightmare is to appear in any way unsavvy, like an out-of-it rookie who doesn't know the score. These Fair Enough ads isolate and prey on that insecurity, and they do a great job. With a dead-on rerun sitcom parody, jumpy establishing shot, upbeat horn section, theme song ending on a slightly unresolved note, 3-wall, 2-camera set, canned laugh track. The ads first establish their own savvy, knowing coolness before inviting us to join them in ridiculing Big Tobacco's schemes. The spots are darkly comic, just the way teens like it, and rather than serving up yet more boring evidence that smoking is deadly, something that all teens, including the ones who smoke, already know, the ads move on to the far more satisfying step: kicking Big Tobacco in the groin. Examining arguments from the heart. Pathos. Arguments from the heart appeal to readers' emotions and feelings. Some emotional appeals are, in fact, just ploys to win readers over with a pretty face, figurative or real. You've seen ads promising an exciting life and attractive friends if only you drink the right beer or wear designer clothes. Are you fooled by such claims? Probably not, if you pause to think about them. But that's the strategy, isn't it? To distract you from thought just long enough to make a bad choice. It's a move worth commenting upon in a rhetorical analysis. Yet you might also want to applaud illogical appeals that nonetheless work brilliantly. Consider the stylish iPod TV spots, just silhouettes of people dancing to the tunes from their white earbuds. How do these spots make their case, and is the emotional spike they create suited to the product? Emotions can add real muscle to arguments too. For example, persuading people not to drink and drive by making them fear death, injury, or arrest seems like a fair use of an emotional appeal. That's exactly what the Texas Department of Transportation did in 2002 when it created a memorable ad campaign. See the figure on page 111, featuring the image of a formerly beautiful young woman horribly scarred in a fiery accident caused by a driver who'd had too much to drink. In an analysis, you might note the impact of the headline right above the gut-wrenching image. Not everyone who gets hit by a drunk driver dies. In analyzing emotional appeals, judge whether the emotions raised, be they anger, sympathy, fear, envy, joy, or love, advance the claims offered. Consider how Paula Begala, a media commentator and former advisor to President Clinton, uses graphic language: lynch-dragged, crucified, bludgeoned, and deliberate repetition, it's read, to provoke revulsion against states that had just voted Republican in a recent presidential election. You see the states where James Byrd was lynch dragged behind a pickup truck until his body came apart. It's red. You see the state where Matthew Shepard was crucified on a split rail fence for the crime of being gay. It's red. You see the state where right-wing extremists blew up a federal office building and murdered scores of federal employees. It's red. The state where an army private who was thought to be gay was bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat. And the state where neo-Nazi skinheads murdered 2 African Americans because of their skin color. And the state where Bob Jones University spews its anti-Catholic bigotry. They're all red too. Paul Begala, Banana Republicans. Does the passion here move you, or does it suggest an argument out of control, damaging its own case? Your task in rhetorical analysis would be to study an author's words, the emotions they evoke, and the claims they support, and then to make such a judgment. Examining arguments based on character. Ethos. It should come as no surprise. Readers believe writers who seem honest, wise, and trustworthy. So in examining the effectiveness of an argument, look for evidence of these traits. Does the writer have the experience or authority to write on this subject? Are all claims qualified reasonably? Is evidence presented in full, not tailored to the writer's agenda? Are important objections to the author's position acknowledged and addressed? Are sources documented? Above all, does the writer sound trustworthy? Here, in a paragraph from a lengthy argument about church-state conflicts in the United States, Professor Noah Feldman of the New York University School of Law hits just the right notes to sound concerned, thoughtful, and above all, even-handed in balancing the rights of both. Values evangelicals who see a role for religion in the political arena and legal secularists who would rather keep religion out of public deliberations. The solution I have in mind rests on the basic principle of protecting the liberty of conscience. So long as all citizens have the same right to speak and act free of correction, no adult should feel threatened or excluded by the symbolic or political speech of others, however much he may disagree with it. If many congressmen say that their faith requires intervening to save Terry Schiavo, that is not a violation of the rules of political debate. The secular congresswoman who thinks Schiavo should have the right to die in peace can express her contrary view and explain why it is that she believes a rational and legal analysis of the situation requires it. She may lose the vote, but she is not excluded from the process or from the body that votes against her, any more than a Republican would be excluded from a committee controlled by Democrats. Noah Feldman, A Church-State Solution. In performing such an analysis, pay attention to the details, right down to the choice of words, or, in a visual argument, the shapes and colors. The modest, tentative tone of the solution I have in mind in Feldman's argument is an example of the kind of choice that can shape an audience's perception of ethos. But these details need your interpretation. Language that's hot and extreme can mark a writer as either passionate or loony. Work that's sober and carefully organized might suggest that an institution is either competent or anal. Technical terms and abstract phrases can make a writer seem either knowledgeable or pompous. Examining arguments based on facts and reason, logos. In judging most arguments, you'll have to decide whether an argument makes a plausible claim and offers good reasons for you to believe it. Not all arguments you read will package such claims in a single neat sentence or thesis, nor should they. A writer may tell a story from which you have to infer the claim. Think of the way many films make a social or political statement by dramatizing an issue, whether it be political corruption, government censorship, or economic injustice. Visual arguments may work the same way. Viewers have to assemble the parts and draw inferences before they get the point. In some conventional arguments, the sort you might find on an editorial page, arguments may be perfectly obvious. Writers stake out a claim and then offer the reasons you should consider. or they work in the opposite direction, laying out a case that leads you toward a conclusion. Consider the following examples. The first is a provocative opening paragraph by an economist, Paul Krugman, previewing the contents of his column in the New York Times. The second occurs near the conclusion of a lengthy article defending the car against its many snobbish critics. 15 years ago, when Japanese companies were busily buying up chunks of corporate America, I was one of those urging Americans not to panic. You might therefore expect me to offer similar soothing words now that the Chinese are doing the same thing. But the Chinese challenge, highlighted by the bids for Maytag and Unocal, looks a lot more serious than the Japanese challenge ever did. Paul Krugman, The Chinese Challenge. But even if we do all the things that can be done to limit the social costs of cars, the campaign against them will not stop. It will not stop because so many of the critics dislike everything the car stands for and everything society constructs to serve the needs of its occupants. James Q. Wilson, Cars and Their Enemies. Think of claims like these as vortices of energy in an argument. You need to identify any such statements and then examine a text carefully to see how sometimes, whether they're supported by good reasons and reliable evidence. A lengthy essay may, in fact, contain a series of claims, each developed to support an even larger point. Indeed, every paragraph in an argument may develop a specific and related idea. In a rhetorical analysis, you need to track down all these separate propositions and examine the relationships among them. Are they solidly linked? Are there inconsistencies that the writer should acknowledge? Does the end of the piece support what the writer said and promised at the beginning? Since many logical appeals rely heavily on data and information from sources, you'll also need to examine the quality of the information presented in an argument, assessing how accurately such information is reported, how conveniently it's displayed, in charts or graphs, for example, and how well the sources cited represent a range of respected opinion on a topic. Knowing how to judge the quality of sources is more important now than ever because the electronic pathways, where increasing numbers of writers find their information, are clogged with junk. The computer terminal may have become the equivalent of a library reference room in certain ways, but the sources available online vary much more widely in quality. As a consequence, both readers and writers of arguments today must know the difference between reliable, first-hand, or fully documented sources and those that don't meet such standards. For more on using and documenting sources, see chapters 19 and 20. Examining the shape and media of arguments. Arguments have a structure. Aristotle carved the structure of logical argument to its bare bones when he observed that it had only two parts: statement, proof. You could do worse in examining an argument than just to make sure that every claim a writer makes is backed by sufficient evidence. Most arguments you read and write, however, will be more than mere statements followed by proofs. Some writers will lay their cards on the table immediately. Others may lead you carefully through a chain of claims toward a conclusion. Writers may even interrupt their arguments to offer background information or cultural contexts for readers. Sometimes they'll tell stories or provide anecdotes that make an argumentative point. They'll qualify the arguments they make too, so they don't bite off more than they can chew. Smart writers may even pause to admit that other points of view are plausible, though they might also spend time undercutting such contrary opinions or evidence. In other words, there are no formulas or acceptable patterns that fit all successful arguments. Many are written on the fly in the heat of a moment. In writing a rhetorical analysis, you'll have to assess the organization of a persuasive text on its own merits. It's fair, however, to complain about what may be absent from an argument. Most arguments of proposal, see Chapter 11, for example, include a section that defends the feasibility of a new idea, explaining how it might be funded or managed in a rhetorical analysis. You might fault an editorial that supports a new stadium for a city without addressing feasibility issues. Similarly, analyzing a movie review that reads like off the top of the head opinion, you might legitimately ask what criteria of evaluation are in play. See Chapter 9. You also may find that an argument benefits from strong transitions, helpful headings, or a confident voice that makes navigating the claims easy. Don't take such an accomplishment for granted, nor should you ignore the way a writer or institution uses media in an argument. Would an argument originally made in an editorial, for instance, work better as a cartoon, or vice versa? Would a lengthy paper have more power if it included more images, or do you find that images distract from a written argument, diminishing its substance? These are important issues you might comment on or connect to other aspects of an argument, such as its style. Finally, be open to the possibility of new or non-traditional structures of arguments. The visual arguments you analyze may defy conventional principles of logic or arrangement. For example, making juxtapositions rather than logical transitions between elements, or using quick cuts, fades, or other devices to link ideas. Quite often, these non-traditional structures will also resist the neatness of a thesis, leaving it up to readers to construct at least a part of the argument in their heads. Advertisers are growing quite fond of these sorts of soft-sell multimedia productions that can seem more like games or entertainments than what they really are, product pitches. We're asked not just to buy a product, but also to live its lifestyle. Is that a reasonable or workable strategy for an argument? Your analysis might entertain such possibilities. Looking at style. Even a coherent argument flush with evidence may not connect with readers if it's dull, off-key, or offensive. Readers naturally judge the credibility of arguments in part by how stylishly the case is made, even when they don't know exactly what style is. Consider how these simple, blunt sentences from the opening of an argument shape your image of the author and probably determine whether you're willing to continue to read the whole piece. We are young, urban, and professional. We are literate, respectable, intelligent, and charming. But foremost and above all, we know what it's like to be unemployed. Julia Carlyle, young, privileged, and unemployed. Now consider how you'd approach an argument that begins like the following, responding to a botched primary election in Florida following the electoral disaster of 2000. The question you're asking yourself is, does South Florida contain the highest concentration of morons in the entire world, or just in the United States? The reason you're asking this, of course, is South Florida's performance in Tuesday's election. This election was critical to our image because of our performance in the 2000 presidential election, the one that ended up with the entire rest of the nation watching impatiently as clumps of sleep-deprived South Florida election officials squinted at cardboard ballots, trying to figure out what the hell the voters were thinking when they apparently voted for two presidents, or no presidents, or part of a president, or in some cases simply drooled on the ballot. Dave Barry, How to Vote in One Easy Step. Both styles probably work, but they signal that the writers are about to make very different kinds of cases. Style alone tells readers what to expect. Manipulating style also enables writers to shape readers' responses to their ideas. Devices as simple as repetition and parallelism can give sentences remarkable power. Consider this sentence from Andrew Sullivan, who argues for greater tolerance of homosexuals in American culture. Growing up homosexual was to grow up normally, but displaced, to experience romantic love, but with the wrong person, to entertain grand ambitions, but of the unacceptable sort, to seek a gradual self-awakening, but in secret, not in public. Andrew Sullivan, What Are Homosexuals For? The balanced style of this sentence asks readers to pay attention and perhaps to sympathize, but the entire argument can't be presented in this key without exhausting readers. And it isn't. Style has to be modulated almost like music to keep readers tuned in. In a rhetorical analysis, you can explore many stylistic choices, but why does a formal style work for discussing one type of subject matter, but not another? How does a writer use humor or irony to underscore an important point? The balanced style of this sentence asks readers to pay attention and perhaps to sympathize, but the entire argument can't be presented in this key without exhausting readers, and it isn't. Style has to be modulated, almost like music, to keep readers tuned in. In a rhetorical analysis, you can explore many stylistic choices. Why does a formal style work for discussing one type of subject matter, but not another? How does a writer use humor or irony to underscore an important point or to manage a difficult concession? Do stylistic choices, even something as simple as the use of contractions, bring readers comfortably close to a writer, or do a highly technical vocabulary and impersonal voice signal that an argument is for experts only? To describe the stylistic effects of visual arguments, you may use a different vocabulary, talking about colors, camera angles, editing, balance, proportion, fonts, perspective, and so on. But the basic principle is this: the look of an item. Whether it be a poster, an editorial cartoon, or a film documentary, can support the message it carries, undermine it, or muddle it. In some cases, the look will be the message. In a rhetorical analysis, you can't ignore style. Examining a rhetorical analysis. Following is an argument in defense of free speech by Derek Bach, a distinguished scholar and past president of Harvard University, credentials that certainly add to his ethos. Responding to it with a detailed analysis is Melina Atea, a college student who reveals in her piece that she, too, brings unique credentials to this case. Protecting Freedom of Expression at Harvard. Derek Bach. March 25, 1991. For several years, universities have been struggling with the problem of trying to reconcile the rights of free speech with the desire to avoid racial tension. In recent weeks, such a controversy has sprung up at Harvard. Two students hung Confederate flags in public view, upsetting students who equate the Confederacy with slavery. A third student tried to protest the flags by displaying a swastika. These incidents have provoked much discussion and disagreement. Some students have urged that Harvard require the removal of symbols that offend many members of the community. Others reply that such symbols are a form of free speech and should be protected. Different universities have resolved similar conflicts in different ways. Some have enacted codes to protect their communities from forms of speech that are deemed to be insensitive to the feelings of other groups. Some have refused to impose such restrictions. It is important to distinguish between the appropriateness of such communications and their status under the First Amendment. The fact that speech is protected by the First Amendment does not necessarily mean that it is right, proper, or civil. I am sure that the vast majority of Harvard students believe that hanging a Confederate flag in public view or displaying a swastika in response is insensitive and unwise because any satisfaction it gives to the students who display these symbols is far outweighed by the discomfort it causes to many others. I share this view and regret that the students involved saw fit to behave in this fashion, whether or not they merely wished to manifest their pride in the South or to demonstrate the insensitivity of hanging Confederate flags by mounting another offensive symbol in return. They must have known that they would upset many fellow students and ignore the decent regard for the feelings of others so essential to building and preserving a strong and harmonious community. To disapprove of a particular form of communication, however, is not enough to justify prohibiting it. We are faced with a clear example of the conflict between our commitment to free speech and our desire to foster a community founded on mutual respect. Our society has wrestled with this problem for many years. Interpreting the First Amendment, the Supreme Court has clearly struck the balance in favor of free speech. While communities do have the right to regulate speech in order to uphold aesthetic standards, avoiding defacement of buildings, or to protect the public from disturbing noise, rules of this kind must be applied across the board and cannot be enforced selectively to prohibit certain kinds of messages but not others. Under the Supreme Court's rulings, as I read them, the display of swastikas or Confederate flags clearly falls within the protection of the free speech clause of the First Amendment and cannot be forbidden simply because it offends the feelings of many members of the community. These rulings apply to all agencies of government, including public universities. Although it is unclear to what extent the First Amendment is enforceable against private institutions, I have difficulty understanding why a university such as Harvard should have less free speech than the surrounding society or than a public university. One reason why the power of censorship is so dangerous is that it is extremely difficult to decide when a particular communication is offensive enough to warrant prohibition or to weigh the degree of offensiveness against the potential value of the communication. If we begin to forbid flags, it is only a short step to prohibiting offensive speakers. I suspect that no community will become humane and caring by restricting what its members can say. The worst offenders will simply find other ways to irritate and insult. In addition, once we start to declare certain things offensive, with all the excitement and attention that will follow, I fear that much ingenuity will be exerted trying to test the limits, much time will be expended trying to draw tenuous distinctions, and the resulting publicity will eventually attract more attention to the offensive material than would ever have occurred otherwise. Rather than prohibit such communications, with all the resulting risks, it would be better to ignore them, since students would then have little reason to create such displays and would soon abandon them. If this response is not possible, and one can understand why, the wisest course is to speak with those who perform insensitive acts and try to help them understand the effects of their actions on others. Appropriate officials and faculty members should take the lead, as the Harvard housemasters have already done in this case. In talking with students, they should seek to educate and persuade, rather than resort to ridicule or intimidation, recognizing that only persuasion is likely to produce a lasting, beneficial effect. Through such effects, I believe that we act in the manner most consistent with our ideals as an educational institution, and most calculated to help us create a truly understanding, supportive community. A Curse and a Blessing. Melina Atea. In 1991, when Derek Bach's essay, Protecting Freedom of Expression at Harvard, was first published in the Boston Globe, I had just come to America to escape the oppressive communist regime in Bulgaria. Perhaps my background explains why I support Bach's argument that we should not put arbitrary limits on freedom of expression. Bach wrote the essay in response to a public display of Confederate flags and a swastika at Harvard, a situation that created a heated controversy among the students. As Bach notes, universities have struggled to achieve a balance between maintaining students' rights of free speech and avoiding racist attacks. When choices must be made, however, Bach argues for preserving freedom of expression. In order to support his claim and bridge the controversy, Bach uses a variety of rhetorical strategies. The author first immerses the reader in the controversy by vividly describing the incident. 2 Harvard students had hung Confederate flags in public view, thereby upsetting students who equate the Confederacy with slavery. Another student, protesting the flags, decided to display an even more offensive symbol, the swastika. These actions provoked heated discussions among students. Some students believed that school officials should remove the offensive symbols, whereas others suggested that the symbols are a form of free speech and should be protected. Bach establishes common ground between the factions. He regrets the actions of the offenders, but does not believe we should prohibit such actions just because we disagree with them. The author earns the reader's respect because of his knowledge, and through his logical presentation of the issue and partial support of his position, Bach refers to U.S. Supreme Court rulings, which remind us that the display of swastikas or Confederate flags clearly falls within the protection of the free speech clause of the First Amendment. The author also emphasizes the danger of the slippery slope of censorship when he warns the reader, if we begin to forbid flags,
it is only a short step to prohibiting offensive speakers. Overall, however, Bach's work lacks the kind of evidence that statistics, interviews with students, and other representative examples of controversial conduct could provide. Thus, his essay may not be strong enough to persuade all readers to make the leap from his specific situation to his general conclusion. Throughout, Bach's personal feelings are implied but not stated directly. As a lawyer who was president of Harvard for 20 years, Bach knows how to present his opinions respectfully without offending the feelings of the students. However, qualifying phrases like, "I suspect that," and "under the Supreme Court's rulings as I read them," could weaken the effectiveness of his position. Furthermore, Bach's attempt to be fair to all seems to dilute the strength of his proposed solution. He suggests that one should either ignore the insensitive deeds in the hope that students might change their behavior, or talk to the offending students to help them comprehend how their behavior is affecting other students. Nevertheless, although Bach's proposed solution to the controversy does not appear at first reading to be very strong, it may ultimately be effective. There is enough flexibility in his approach to withstand various tests, and Bach's solution is general enough that it can change with the times and adapt to community standards. In writing this essay, Bach faced a challenging task: to write a short response to a specific situation that represents a very broad and controversial issue. Some people may find that freedom of expression is both a curse and a blessing because of the difficulties it creates. As one who has lived under a regime that permitted very limited censored expression, I am all too aware that I could not have written this response in 1991 in Bulgaria. As a result, I feel, like Derek Bach, that freedom of expression is a blessing, in spite of any temporary problems associated with it.